Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast. Where we untangle the threads of these really complex topics, and we try to weave them into a narrative that you can actually follow.
Makes sense.
Today we are venturing into a pretty murky world,
Oh, yeah.
the origins of COVID-19. And we were going to grapple with that controversial lab leak theory. You've probably seen the headlines, heard the whispers, maybe even formed an opinion or two. But are we really ready for the full story?
Well, what I find so captivating about this deep dive is that we're not just looking at a scientific puzzle here. We're delving into a mystery that has implications for literally everyone around the globe. It touches upon international relations, scientific ethics, and even the nature of trust in a world that's just bombarded with information.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we get lost in that labyrinth, let's try to establish a baseline. Most scientists at least agree that COVID-19, like many infectious diseases that came before it likely originated in animals. This is what we call zoonosis.
Exactly. Think about it like Lyme disease. You go for a hike, a tick bites you, and all of a sudden you're dealing with this complex illness. That's zoonosis in action, a disease leaping from the animal kingdom into ours. In the case of COVID-19, the prime suspect for the original host is bats. But the question that really sets this deep dive in motion is, how did the virus make the jump to humans?
Right, because it's not like bats are, shaking hands with people and going to cocktail parties.
Sure.
So was there an intermediate animal,
Uh-huh.
a missing link? And is that where the Wuhan Institute of Virology enters the narrative?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, the answer is far from straightforward. The Wuhan Institute of Virology, or WIV as it's often called, was indeed studying bat coronaviruses, some of which are genetically similar to SARS-CoV-2, the virus responsible for COVID-19. And yes, the WID is located in the same city where the pandemic first emerged. But does that geographic proximity automatically point to a lab leak? Not necessarily.
I can see how people would connect those dots, though. But wouldn't labs that are studying these dangerous viruses be located near those potential outbreak zones? It's like setting up a fire station near a building. You want it close in case of an emergency.
Exactly. It's about preparedness and the ability to, respond quickly. Furthermore, it's important to note that the WIV isn't unique in this regard. A lot of major Chinese cities actually have labs that are dedicated to researching coronaviruses. It's part of a broader effort to understand and potentially prevent future outbreaks.
Okay, so the location itself might not be as suspicious as some of those headlines suggest, but what about the nature of the research being conducted at the WIV? There's been a lot of talk about gain-of-function research, and that sounds kind of ominous.
Right. Gain-of-function research, it is definitely a controversial area. It involves modifying viruses in a lab setting to understand how they might evolve and become more transmissible or deadly. The goal is to get ahead of potential threats and develop countermeasures.
So some people are suggesting that COVID-19 was deliberately engineered in a lab to be more dangerous, and then intentionally or accidentally released. That's taking us deep into conspiracy theory territory.
It is a claim that has been circulating, and it often centers around this specific feature of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's known as the furin cleavage site. This site essentially makes the virus better at infecting human cells, so those promoting the engineered virus theory argue that this furin cleavage site is evidence of human manipulation.
That does sound a bit like someone was tinkering with the virus to make it spread more effectively. But if this furin cleavage site is so unique, shouldn't that settle the debate?
Well, that's where things get more nuanced. While the furin cleavage site does enhance the virus's ability to infect human cells, it's not actually unique to SARS-CoV-2. Scientists have found similar sites in other coronaviruses, and the way that it's structured in SARS-CoV-2 makes it highly unlikely to have been engineered. Natural evolution is the far more probable explanation.
Okay, so it's not a smoking gun, that's a release. But let's step back for a moment and clarify what we're actually dealing with here. We're talking about two main possibilities: an accidental lab leak of a naturally occurring virus, or a deliberately engineered and released virus. Essentially two very different stories, with vastly different implications.
Precisely. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. Of course, there are various shades of theories in between, but those two scenarios really frame the central debate.
And I'm guessing the evidence for each side is pretty murky.
Well, let's start with the engineered virus theory. The biggest challenge for this hypothesis is the complete lack of evidence that any lab, including the WIV, possessed SARS-CoV-2 before the pandemic began.
Okay, that seems like a pretty significant blow to the engineered theory. What about the accidental release? What evidence, if any, supports that scenario?
Proponents of the accidental release theory often point to the fact that we haven't definitively identified an intermediate animal host that kind of bridges the gap between bats and humans. They argue that this absence is suspicious.
But couldn't that simply mean we haven't looked hard enough? I mean, tracing the origins of a virus back to its source is a massive undertaking, right?
That's the counter-argument that a lot of scientists make. The search for the origin of a virus can take years, even decades sometimes. It requires meticulous detective work, tracing the virus's genetic lineage, studying animal populations, and painstakingly piecing together a really complex puzzle.
Before we get any deeper into this investigation, we wanted to take a quick pause and encourage you to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on future deep dives like this one, where we unpack complex topics and bring you stories that matter.
We're just getting started on this journey. You won't want to miss what's coming next.
Now back to our investigation. We can't talk about the origins of COVID-19 without addressing the elephant in the room. The World Health Organization, or WHO, they've been at the forefront of this investigation, haven't they? What have they uncovered?
Well, the WHO conducted a pretty thorough investigation back in 2021. It culminated in a report that concluded that a lab leak was extremely unlikely. However, they've since acknowledged that they may have dismissed that possibility a little too quickly and have called for further investigation.
But hasn't China been reluctant to cooperate with those investigations? I mean, that lack of transparency has fueled a lot of speculation, hasn't it?
Absolutely. China's lack of transparency has definitely been a significant obstacle in getting to the bottom of this. It's made it difficult for independent experts to access crucial data and to conduct their own analyses.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, conflicting information, and a whole lot of political tension swirling around this issue. It's no wonder the lab leak theory has become such a global hot potato.
Absolutely. It's strained relations between the U.S. and China, and unfortunately, it's often been used to fuel anti-Asian sentiment, which is incredibly damaging.
You know, this whole situation reminds me of the 1977 Russian flu outbreak.
Ah, yes. The only pandemic ever definitively linked to a lab leak.
Right. But wasn't that a different situation? Didn't it involve an older strain of the virus?
You're absolutely correct. The 1977 Russian flu was caused by a strain of influenza that had circulated years prior. It wasn't a novel virus like SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, so not a perfect parallel. But it does highlight that lab leaks, while rare, are not unprecedented. It makes you wonder, though, how has this whole debate impacted the scientists who are trying to research the origins of COVID-19? I mean, they're caught in the crossfire of a very heated debate.
It's been an incredibly challenging environment for a lot of scientists, some who have even dared to suggest the possibility of a lab leak, or simply called for a more thorough investigation, have faced intense scrutiny, online harassment, and even threats.
Wow, that's truly concerning. Scientists should be able to explore different hypotheses and share their findings without fear of reprisal. Isn't open scientific debate crucial to getting to the truth?
Absolutely. Attempting to silence or discredit researchers, simply because their findings might challenge a particular narrative, is dangerous and counterproductive. It undermines the scientific process, and it hinders our ability to understand and prevent future pandemics.
It's a shame that they're facing that kind of backlash. I mean, this isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding how this pandemic started so we can prevent future ones.
Exactly. And even if it turns out that COVID-19 didn't originate from a lab, this whole debate has really shone a light on some critical questions about the safety and ethics of scientific research, especially when you're dealing with these potentially dangerous pathogens.
Right. It's like a wake-up call. We can't just assume that everything is being done responsibly and safely behind those closed lab doors.
Yeah, this pandemic has definitely brought the issue of biosafety and biosecurity into sharp focus.
So where do we go from here? What needs to happen to get some more definitive answers about the origins of COVID-19? And what steps can we take to prevent similar controversies? Or even actual lab leaks from happening in the future?
Those are the million-dollar questions. First and foremost, we need more international collaboration and transparency. Open access to data, samples, research findings is absolutely crucial.
So you mean giving independent experts from around the world the ability to examine lab records, conduct their own analyses, really scrutinize the evidence without any restrictions?
Precisely. And it can't just be a one-sided effort. It needs to be a genuine partnership between international organizations like the WHO and countries like China where the outbreak originated.
That makes sense in theory. But do you really think that kind of cooperation is realistic? Given the current political climate and the tensions between the U.S. and China, it seems like a long shot.
It might be a long and winding road, but I believe it's the only path to achieving a truly comprehensive and trustworthy understanding of what happened. The stakes are simply too high to allow politics to stand in the way of scientific progress and global health.
I hope you're right. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the human side of this story. We've talked about the pressure that scientists are facing, but what about the impact on people's trust in science and scientific institutions? Has this whole debate eroded public confidence?
That's a complex issue. I think it's fair to say that the politicization of the lab leak theory has contributed to a sense of distrust and confusion among some segments of the population. You know, when people see scientists seemingly contradicting each other, or when they perceive that information is being withheld or manipulated, it can sow seeds of doubt.
Yeah, it's like we're being asked to choose sides in this debate, where the experts themselves don't seem to agree. And when trust in those reliable sources of information breaks down, it creates a vacuum that's easily filled by misinformation and conspiracy theories.
That's exactly the danger. Misinformation spreads like wildfire in environments where trust is low and uncertainty is high.
So how do we rebuild that trust? How do we ensure that people have access to accurate, reliable information about these complex scientific issues without getting bogged down in political agendas or sensationalized headlines?
It's a multifaceted challenge. Part of the solution lies in fostering a more open and transparent dialogue between scientists and the public. Scientists need to do a better job of communicating their findings in a way that's accessible and understandable without oversimplifying or talking down to people.
Right. And it's not just about explaining the science itself. It's also about being upfront about the uncertainties, the limitations of the research, the areas where more investigation is needed. People can handle nuance and complexity if they feel like they're being treated with respect and honesty.
Absolutely. And we also need to be more critical of the information we encounter. Just because something appears in a headline or goes viral on social media doesn't mean it's accurate or reliable.
We all need to develop those critical thinking skills to evaluate information, consider the source, and look for evidence-based conclusions.
We can't just passively absorb information. We need to engage with it actively, ask questions, and seek out diverse perspectives.
You know, as we're talking about this, it strikes me that the lab leak debate is, in many ways, a reflection of the broader challenges we face. In a world that's just overflowing with information, it's a reminder that we all need to be more discerning, more critical, and more willing to engage in these thoughtful, nuanced conversations, even when they're difficult.
Well said. It's easy to get swept up in the immediacy of news cycles and social media trends, but we need to cultivate a more deliberate and reflective approach to information consumption. We need to slow down, dig deeper, and resist the temptation to jump to conclusions.
It's a call to be more mindful, more curious, and more committed to seeking the truth, even when it's elusive.
And to remember that science is an ongoing process of discovery. It's not about having all the answers right away. It's about constantly asking questions, testing hypotheses, and refining our understanding as new evidence emerges.
It's about embracing uncertainty, being open to the possibility that our initial assumptions might be wrong. And that's okay. That's how science progresses.
Exactly. It's through that process of questioning, revising, and refining that we get closer to a more accurate and complete understanding of the world around us.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the complexities of the lab leak theory, the challenges of scientific communication, and the importance of critical thinking in a world of information overload. But where does this leave us? What are some tangible steps we can take as individuals to be more informed and prepared for future health challenges, regardless of how this particular debate unfolds?
That's a great question, and it's one that each of us needs to grapple with. For starters, we need to stay informed, but be discerning about our sources of information. Rely on reputable scientific organizations, public health agencies, and fact-checking resources to get accurate and unbiased information.
Don't just rely on headlines or social media posts. Dig a little deeper, read beyond the summaries, and try to understand the nuances of the issue.
And be wary of information that confirms your existing biases or plays on your fears. It's easy to fall into echo chambers where we only encounter information that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs. Challenge yourself to seek out diverse perspectives. Engage with information that might challenge your assumptions.
Right. It's also crucial to support scientific research and public health initiatives. These are the very institutions that are working to understand and prevent future pandemics. Advocate for increased funding, transparency, and international collaboration in scientific research.
And last but not least, be proactive about your own health. Stay up to date on vaccinations, practice good hygiene, and be aware of the potential risks of zoonotic diseases, especially when traveling or interacting with animals.
Those are all great points. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting ourselves and our communities from future health threats. It's not just about relying on scientists and public health officials to solve the problem. We all need to be informed, engaged, and proactive. It sounds like navigating this landscape requires a healthy dose of skepticism, a commitment to staying informed, and a willingness to embrace the fact that there might not be easy answers.
You've hit the nail on the head. This isn't about blindly trusting everything you hear or dismissing everything that challenges your worldview. It's about cultivating a critical but open mind, being willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and understanding that the scientific process is constantly evolving.
We've been talking about the lab leak theory for a while now, but I think it's important to step back and acknowledge the human toll of this pandemic. Regardless of how it started, millions of people have lost their lives, countless others have suffered long-term health consequences, and the world has been irrevocably changed.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get lost in the scientific details and the geopolitical debates. But we can't lose sight of the profound human impact of this tragedy.
It's a stark reminder that pandemics are not just abstract scientific concepts. They're real-life events that have devastating consequences for individuals, families, and entire communities.
And it underscores the urgent need for global cooperation, scientific innovation, and a renewed commitment to public health preparedness.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the complexities of zoonosis, delved into the controversies surrounding gain-of-function research, and grappled with the ongoing debate about the origins of COVID-19.
We've examined the evidence, considered different perspectives, and discussed the implications for scientific integrity, global health security, and the public's trust in science.
It's been a deep dive, and I hope it's left you with more knowledge, more questions, and perhaps even a sense of empowerment.
Because knowledge is power. And the more we understand about pandemics, the better equipped we'll be to prevent and respond to future threats.
So as we wrap up this episode of Tell Me More, we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. Even if we never conclusively determine the origins of COVID-19, what steps can we take individually and collectively to create a safer, healthier, and more resilient world?
It's a question worth pondering, because ultimately the future of global health depends not just on scientists and policymakers, but on all of us.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We'll see you next time on Tell Me More.